So can you still see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine, because my video is gone, but that's not a problem. As long as you can see my slides, I'm just leaving it.
Okay.
I'll sort out the camera when I'm done.
All right.
Okay.
So are these people all talking to each other? You're viewing Jackie Woodman's screen, Prof. Jackie Woodman.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, so if everyone can see that, that's the first speaker. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of God be upon all of you. My name is Dr. Taj Hauge, the president of the Open Mosque, and we are very pleased to welcome everyone to this groundbreaking webinar on the interaction between COVID-19 and the Abrahamic faith. We will have three very distinguished speakers tonight in sequence of speaking. The first is Professor Jacqueline Woodman. She studied medicine in Stellenbosch University and then pursued doctoral studies at Oxford University. She is currently senior consultant at Coventry Hospital and also a professor at Warwick Medical School. She's a practicing Christian, so she'll be the first speaker. The second speaker is Dr. Joanne Abrahams, a health specialist and general physician in Johannesburg. She studied at Witwatersrand University and did an internship at Ellen Joseph Hospital. She is widely respected in the Jewish community. She has profound knowledge of her faith and, of course, of medicine as well. Our last speaker is Dr. Shaima Al-Farsi from Kuwait. She is a senior specialist in nuclear medicine at the leading hospital there. She studied in Dublin at the Royal College of Surgeons and is a devout Muslim as well, and is very, of course, interested in the interrelationship between medicine and her faith. Each of the speakers will be speaking for 20 minutes, and I will give them a 5-minute warning before the end of time for them to wrap up their presentation. And then the next speaker follows. After all the speakers have given their presentations, we will then open up for the whole group. Any questions, answers, comments, agreements, disagreements you might have had with any of our speakers. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Jacqueline Woodman to be the first speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me, and I'm very sorry, but my video is currently not working, but the screen share has got my slides on, so I will hope to sort the video out for the rest of the meeting. I'd like to start off by, sorry, my screen is just frozen. Thank you. I'd like to start off just by reminding everyone what we are actually dealing with here. On the 12th of January, the World Health Organization confirmed that a novel coronavirus was the cause of a new respiratory illness in a cluster of people in Wuhan City, China. And China had reported this to the WHO about 2 weeks previously to that. I practice in the UK, and the COVID-19 pandemic spread to the UK in about mid-January 2020. In March, the UK government imposed a stay-at-home order banning all non-essential travel and contact with people outside one's home, and shut almost all schools, businesses, venues, facilities, amenities, and for the purposes of this particular discussion, places of worship. It was anticipated by an important report from Imperial College London that this lockdown would reduce the number of dead from an unmitigated 500,000 people to less than 20,000. As of the 23rd of July 2020, there have been 45,000 deaths confirmed in the UK, more than double the amount that had been anticipated if we had actually, when lockdown was imposed. So I think this just underlines how serious this particular pandemic has become, and how it has changed the way that people think, not just of their own personal circumstances, but how we think of our communities and the faith groups that we practice in. For those who don't have a medical background, just a little bit about the background to this particular virus. So COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease, discovered in 2019, and its presentation, we are still finding evidence of new ways in which this virus presents. It does not present in the typical way that a cold virus presents, because coronavirus is essentially a cold virus. Yes, there's fever, there's fatigue, there's a dry cough and loss of appetite, which you can get with any viral syndrome. But there are also other interesting things like loss of smell, sometimes nausea, vomiting, sometimes diarrhea, which shows that this is not simply a lung or a respiratory disease. This tends to be a multi-system disease. And the complications, the list that you see in front of you, the list is exhaustive. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list of everything that can possibly happen with COVID-19. In our ITU units and on our wards, we see various presentations and lots of complications that we simply would not anticipate with a coronavirus, a cold virus, or even with influenza, of which probably the most important long-term complication that is now being raised is that of residual lung injury. Even patients who are being discharged out of hospital are having long-term complications as a result of COVID-19. And just to recap why this has impacted on our faith communities so much, this is how coronavirus spreads. And I will, as the talk goes on, draw comparisons with other plagues and other epidemics, and why COVID-19 is so different from some of the other viruses and bacteriums that has caused plague or caused pandemics and epidemics in the past. So this is essentially droplet dispersal through either breathing, coughing, or through contact, not just with a person, but also with surfaces that that person might have touched. And the lockdown came at a time when we were just coming out of the flu season in the UK. It's a slightly different scenario currently in the Southern Hemisphere, which is experiencing their winter flu. But I think nobody quite expected that this acts in a different way to influenza. And in the next 1 or 2 slides, I'll explain exactly what the difference is. But if we do not mitigate against this infection, then one person infects about 2.5 people after about 5 days. And after 30 days, that one person has infected over 400 people. So you can see that this is an extremely contagious disease. Now, I'm a member of the Unitarian community in the UK, and I'm a Unitarian Christian. And in our community, we had to address how we were going to lock down our churches and our chapels when about February, March time, when we knew lockdown was coming. And the initial responses, certainly within the communities that I was talking to, was that, well, this is just another flu, right? This is just a cold virus. It's a flu. It will go over. It will end, just as the flu season, for example, ends after winter. And the problem, of course, is that COVID-19 produces signs and symptoms that are very similar to influenza, and it makes it difficult to distinguish between the two. Certainly, our antigen testing for the virus itself, or the DNA testing for the virus itself, and there was absolutely no antibody testing at the time, was not up and running in February and March. So it made it very difficult to distinguish who had flu, who had a simple cold, and who had COVID-19. But the very interesting thing that I would just want to point out in the next 3 slides is that the death rate of seasonal flu varies, but it's around 0.1%. Now that's about 1 in 1,000 people that will actually die every year. And it kills maybe just over 500,000 people a year worldwide. The death rate for COVID-19 is between 2 to 4%. You'll see in the WHO figures that I'm going to show in a minute that actually it's around about 4% at the moment. And it is much more contagious. It's about double in terms of being contagious. It's at double the rate of influenza. And what everybody also should realize is that seasonal flu comes around in the colder seasons, and it is a seasonal epidemic that goes around the globe, with happening in the northern hemisphere's winter and then in the southern hemisphere's winter. But COVID-19 is not seasonal. It's global and it's constant. And of course, the other thing that everybody else is looking at very, very closely is a vaccine for COVID-19. And although there is some promise that there might be one being developed here in Oxford, we don't have a vaccination program for COVID-19 at the moment. For all of the statistics that I'm now going to quote, I'm going to just be consistent and simply quote the World Health Organization statistics. There are lots of other statistics around, but just to keep it simple, and I've also put the website where you can actually get a daily situation report. This one is as of the 26th of July, because that's when I was putting this talk together. But there's been a daily report by the World Health Organization, and it actually goes according to regions as well. So if you recall, I mentioned that for the flu death rate, there's about 600,000 deaths a year. Well, COVID-19 has now already hit the 600,000 death rate. And if you look at the regions that you can see on the slide, the highest death rates are at the moment happening in the Americas, and because Europe has already been through the peak in Europe as well. But I think everybody can understand that Africa will probably be coming up very soon after that. The darkest areas are where COVID-19 has got the most cases reported. Underreporting is not necessarily indicative that there's no cases. It simply means that the testing isn't in place, and therefore the reporting is not that great. But this is not the most important slide. I think the next slide you will see that we are not through this pandemic yet. The Americas is right at the top in terms of the yellow coloring, and this includes the World Health Organization simply lumps it, South and North America together, but you can see that they are still rising in terms of their peak. And the other regions, although they are slowing down, it is not actually plateauing. So this is by no means over. And if you look at this graph, I think it would be very difficult to see how we could possibly go back to a situation prior to January 2020. It would be a very, very long time before we would reach those kinds of levels. So from a Christian and biblical perspective, and I'm going to give a very brief overview of the two sections of the Bible. The one is called the Old Testament, and the second half is called the New Testament. The Old Testament is much bigger than the New Testament. But the Bible has quite a great deal to say about plagues and pestilence visited upon humanity. And many of these, you might find quite old-fashioned language. You might find that, you know, it doesn't quite, people might not actually relate to it. But of course, since COVID-19 has come, a lot of the language in the Bible suddenly becomes very, very relatable when you talk about plague and pestilence. Now, there's a very specific kind of relationship that the Old Testament describes between God and humanity. And in particular, one of it is to do with punishment for sin. So he describes numerous occasions when God uses scourges and diseases on his people and on his enemies, and it's essentially to impose power and to demonstrate divine power. It's also to demonstrate that there are those who are protected from plagues and pestilence, and those upon which it is inflicted. And one of these would be examples such as plagues being inflicted only on Egypt in trying to force Pharaoh to free the Israelites from bondage, while sparing God's people, of course, from being affected by them. And this you can find in passages in the book of Exodus. And it was also used to warn against disobedience against God, especially in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I've listed the passages there, which I'm sure you could, if you want to look it up, you could read it in your own time. But there's another way in which disease and natural disasters were used in terms of biblical text, and that was to try and draw the faithful unto God. And one of these passages is when God says to Solomon, "When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or I command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land." So this scriptural notion of a loving and gracious God using illness to inflict suffering and punishment, albeit with a noble goal of repentance and restoration, I think raises interesting questions for believers in a modern era, where, let's face it, since antibiotics came along and since antiretrovirals came along, most human beings believe that we can actually get on top of most diseases. We believe that we can conquer cancer. We believe that we can treat most viruses and almost all bacteria. And then something comes along which actually says, you know, for this, there is no treatment, there is no vaccination, there is nothing except totally changing the way in which you live your life in order to try and mitigate against a total disaster. So historically, I'm just going to use one example to demonstrate the Christian responses to pandemics. And probably the most important one is the Black Death, which was not caused by a virus. It was caused by a bacterium that was carried by fleas that infested rats and led to about the eradication of something like a third to almost half of the population of Europe in the 14th century. The Christian belief at that time was that sin is the cause, but it recognized that God doesn't just send a lightning bolt from heaven to strike down sinners, but God works through nature to inflict disease. And the interesting thing is that with the Black Death, the notion that the air was corrupted, and I'll just take you back to the bit about droplet dispersal being the contagious element of COVID-19, but the same idea was that the air was being corrupted and that God corrupted the air to create a pestilence. Of course, in those times, the church offered hope through the sacraments, which would probably not too much help, but it was not anti-medicine. In terms of being supportive of medicine, it certainly suggested remedies, and it suggested mitigation to try and prevent the plague from spreading. And all of the mitigation that it suggested, that medicine suggested, and that the church supported, was aimed at trying to prevent corrupted air from entering the body. So with the next slide, I'd like you maybe to think about what is the difference between 14th century Europe, and I'm working in the UK now, so I will say 21st century Europe. There isn't much difference. You probably could just substitute a bunch of garlic for some alcohol wipes and some disinfectant. But essentially, it comes down to PPE. It comes down to personal protective equipment, and it was thus in the 14th century, and it's obviously exactly the same today with COVID-19. So just moving on into the New Testament, in terms of plague and diseases, emphasis is placed much more, of course, on God bringing wholeness to humanity, and it is used to invest power in the ministry of Christ. For example, in the ability to cure diseases and to cure plagues. And there's lots of examples that you can see on the slide of passages in the New Testament that demonstrate that this is one of the ways in which God emphasizes he affirms his relationship with humanity. Now, you cannot talk about Christian attitudes whether Christians are acting Christians and actually still participating within the worship in Christianity, or whether they are secular Christians and are actually not participating in church life. The Christian perspective has actually really embedded itself in Western Christian culture, so that even though people who might not be going to church would still be influenced by the language, the metaphor, and the ideas that come from the Bible. And so this particular talk cannot be done without talking about the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible, and talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, this particular illustration is from 1,000 years in the Common Era. And if you think about plague and pestilence, it really became a big thing in the 14th century. But this comes from very, very early on in the Christian tradition. And they are described, really, the four horsemen are seen as symbolizing conquest, war, famine, and death and plague. And this Christian apocalyptic vision has, throughout the ages, always reared its head in various forms. But you can imagine the discussion that is now happening, certainly within certain sects of Christianity, about the notion of an apocalyptic event that could be the end of life as we know it. The four horses is the white horse, the red horse, and the black horse. But of course, it is the last one, the pale horse, which is relevant for today. And the scripture says, I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was death, and Hades was following close behind. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And there are lots and lots of metaphorical language in that, of course, but you can see how a lot of this could relate to some of the images that we have been seeing of COVID-19. Now, I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist, right? So what we would advocate as the best start for a child's life is something called skin-to-skin contact at birth. And the human touch has been shown to have a huge amount of beneficial effects on people, both in terms of mental health, in terms of calming anxiety, in terms of reducing stress. And the human touch has been there, I think, in every single aspect of mankind's development, not just at birth, but also at death. And it's this human touch that I think has probably made me realize how much COVID-19 has really changed our world. For Christians, communal worship is at the heart of every community. And communal singing and physical contact by way of handshakes and hugs Sorry, I'm back on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I'm just trying to move my... And so in the same way, rites of passage ceremonies have been brought to a standstill as well, everything from baptism to weddings. And probably the most important aspect of COVID-19 has been the long-term impact on families being unable to say goodbye at funeral and burial services. I think if we look to the future and we maybe want to see what our faith communities could do in terms of dealing with the aftermath of COVID-19, I think I would like to point out that the picture you see in your left-hand corner is a picture of an ITU unit with everybody gowned up and gloved. Okay,
5 minutes,
and once
5 minutes.
5 minutes, and once somebody goes into ITU, the chances of coming out is about 50 to 60%. The mortality rates are extremely high once patients with COVID-19 go into ITU. And so whilst we need to look after the families who have been bereaved, what's even more important is looking at the survivors who have actually survived this terrible process and actually are coming out and now come out into a society where the evidence suggests that they might actually get COVID-19 again if the antibody response has not been what we thought it would be. So the long-term issues of post-traumatic stress disorder and the implications of an imposed isolation and solitude, I think will really be incumbent upon our faith communities to look at the bereavement and the pastoral aspects of care for their members. This, by the way, just to let everybody know what's happening in the UK. I'm sure in other places of the world there's something similar perhaps happening. Lockdown has been eased to a certain extent and places of worship have now been opened, but there has been very, very strict guidance on what cannot be done. And as far as Christian worship is concerned, the Christian worship elements have really been eviscerated. So, for example, services should be as short as possible. Certainly no, mingling over coffee time at the end. Food and drinks, such as, for example, communion, should not be using communal vessels. Imagine a church service with no singing. So no singing, because this can spread the virus. And no musical instruments that are wind instruments to be played. And the list goes on and on. This is just an example of some of it. I think for the last few slides, I just want to leave you with some ideas of what I think we should be taking away from this, certainly from a Christian perspective and from our own perspective, which is very much a Unitarian Christian perspective. Now, there are lots of ideas about how we should view the idea of sin, but I certainly think what COVID-19 has highlighted is the injustice and the wrong that we have committed upon the earth and upon the world. And there are just three things that I would like to point out. Firstly, we need to look at the link between human beings and their encroachment on wildlife spaces. We know how this virus jumped. Now, whether it was engineered or whether it was a natural jump across species, we know that this has come from wildlife. It has come via bats. We still haven't maybe found the intermediate species, but it has made a species jump because human beings encroach on wildlife spaces. I think the second issue we need to look at is global population and density. The reason it has spread so rapidly is because we are incredibly densely populated, and 7 billion people is simply not sustainable with a birth rate that is rising. And then we should look at what we consider to be modern conveniences that allows a regional epidemic to become a pandemic in a very short space of time. And the main driver for that has actually been air travel for business and for leisure. And whilst it's not all doom and gloom, yes, of course, it has caused us to innovate. And here we are having a meeting with the power of Zoom. It has made worship accessible with Zoom services. This is just an example of a Zoom service on the slide. It has made small communities have a global reach because it no longer recognizes physical barriers. But let's not forget that there are challenges in people that do not have Wi-Fi, do not have broadband, and are not able to afford mobile devices and computers to be able to engage in this new world of COVID-19 and Zoom. And of course, for faith groups, there's a loss of real membership to ethereal virtual worshippers who might never actually see each other in person. I think it has brought about a rethinking of our priorities, and it has probably opened up opportunities that we've not imagined before. Has anybody ever heard the word unmute ever as much as we are doing today? I think there's been a new emphasis on linking up with neighbors, of taking care of each other in digital ways that was not always possible with physical connections. And I think for the most part, certainly within our communities, I think there's been an active commitment to taking care of one another in ways that we have not maybe thought about in the past. And that has gone beyond the bounds of just being in terms of faith or just being in terms of religious groups. It's actually moved into the secular world of actually performing small acts of kindness. So I believe, as many other Christian groups, that we should pride ourselves on being quite rational, and actually we should look to science, and we should have a very balanced approach to both religious and secular life. And certainly our knowledge of this virus is still in its early stages, and science and research can only guide us for part of the way. I think in the end, this is going to be a combination of lifestyle adjustments, of drug interventions, and possibly a vaccination program looking in the way forward. But I think collectively, we have not really reflected on the previous regional epidemics because they occurred in distant locations from us. SARS occurred in the East, MERS occurred in the Middle East, and Ebola occurred in Africa. And in all of them, there had been the same underlying issues of overpopulation and human beings living too closely in terms of wildlife and too closely in terms of each other, also in terms of practicing hygienically. I think we have simply not looked at the underlying causes. And I think reflecting on the underlying causes of this particular pandemic may be our best hope to prevent similar occurrences in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Woodman. You've went over your time slightly, so I have to be fair and give other people the same leeway. And I call upon Dr. Joanne Abrams to talk from a Jewish perspective, this interaction and interrelationship between coronavirus and the Abrahamic faith, of course, from the Jewish perspective. Just need to unmute her. The word has just come about. Unmute. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, right. We can hear you. Okay, go for it.
Right. Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Okay. So we're all sitting here in a strange new world, and not one of us has been not directly impacted by the coronavirus pandemic.
No,
As
not
an
true.
Orthodox,
Not
sorry?
true. Not true. I was very, very ill for 8 weeks.
Yeah, so I said none of us have not been directly impacted.
I'm sorry.
Okay. As an Orthodox Jewish family physician, I thought it would help to show how this pandemic has impacted my family directly, and by extension, the Jewish community. In Hebrew, the word for plague is magepha, which comes from the root word negef, which means to be defeated. And a virus is nagif, which comes from that same root. Another word that we use for plague is dever. Dever is described in the Bible when the fifth of the 10 plagues that were brought upon the Egyptians were in Egypt. Dever was the pestilence of animals. So dever comes from the root word diber, to talk. And it's thought either because everyone talks about all the casualties, or because Devar Hashem, the word of God, is fulfilled in the sudden death of a victim. No, I do not think we have been defeated. I think that our ongoing resilience and adaptation we have seen on a personal, communal, and national levels has been inspiring. While I acknowledge the huge difficulties and losses many have experienced, I do believe we can come out of this pandemic stronger and better communities. Let's look at what the Talmud has to say about being safe in an epidemic. The Talmud is the oral law of the Torah. It represents the laws, statutes, and legal interpretations that were not recorded in the 5 books of Moses. It was initially passed down from generation to generation, but eventually written to avoid it becoming lost and forgotten. It is made up of Mishnah, a collection of teachings that were redacted by Yehuda HaNasi in the years following the destruction of the Second Temple. Over the next several hundreds of years, the teachings of the rabbis were eventually collated into two great bodies. The Jerusalem Talmud has the teachings of the rabbis in the land of Israel, and the Babylonian Talmud has the teachings of the rabbis in exile in Babylonia. A page of Talmud is like listening to a live argument, often with comments and differences of opinion of rabbis spanning many different generations. It's important to note that we don't take what's discussed in the Talmud as actual Jewish law or halakha. This is codified in other books. Rather, it's a way of learning and understanding thought processes and opinion. So let's see what the Talmud has to say about plagues. So firstly, a different definition. What constitutes a plague? If a city that can supply 500 foot soldiers and 3 deaths occur on 3 consecutive days, behold, this constitutes a plague. Less than this is not a plague. So as we can see by this definition, that the city has to have 3 deaths or more of their normal death rate on 3 consecutive days. Now let's see, sorry. Yeah. Okay, this is another quote of what the sages, how they talk about quarantining in your home. So the sages taught, if there is a plague in the city, gather your feet, limit the time you spend out of the house, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. And it says in another verse, come my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself for a little moment until the anger has passed by. And it says, outside the sword will bereave, and in the chambers terror. So that last line is quite interesting, that even though you may be shutting yourself away from the danger, it still describes in the chambers terror. It still describes that anxiety we all feel during the lockdown period. Another quote, at the time when there was a plague, Rava would close the windows of his house, as it is written, for death is come up into our windows, and that comes from Jeremiah. So the interesting thing here is Rava was one of the most esteemed rabbis of the Talmudic era, and he was considered quite righteous. Yet when it comes to a plague, no one is safe. Just because you are more righteous than someone else, it doesn't mean that you may be spared, because a plague works differently. And that's why Rava described how he had to close the windows of his house. Another quote, the sages taught, if there is a plague in the city, a person should not walk in the middle of the road, due to the fact that the angel of death walks in the middle of the road, as since in heaven they have given him permission to kill within the city. He goes openly in the middle of the road. By contrast, if there's peace and quiet in the city, do not walk on the sides of the road, as since the angel of death does not have permission to kill within the city, he hides himself and walks on the side of the road. Okay, so we don't take this literally. We're not watching where we're walking in the road, but just that acknowledgement that with a plague, things work differently. There's just a different way about the city. If we have a look at how the Old Testament describes leprosy, leprosy in the Bible is not considered the leprosy we know now. It's more a spiritual affliction. Yet people with leprosy had to literally socially distant and wear masks, as it says here. As for the person with a leprous affection, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover over his upper lip, and he shall call out, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So whereas the quotes before spoke about protecting those who are well by staying inside, these quotes describe how people who are afflicted need to stay away from people who are well. In March this year, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies made the devastating decision to close all synagogues. The main incentive was based on the stats coming out of New York and London, where there was a high percentage of Orthodox Jews being diagnosed. Many of the ultra-Orthodox centers of New York and London were considered hotspots, suggested reasons being that those areas are densely populated and insular, are quite impoverished and shut off from secular life. Many of these communities have a distrust of secular society and leadership and waited for decisions to be made by their own leadership, which was quite slow in coming. It's important to note that infection spread has been pinpointed to many prayer groups due to the enclosed space, duration spent together, singing, and physical contact. Jews pray 3 times a day and are allowed to pray by themselves, but it is preferable to pray in a minyan or a quorum of 10 men. Without a minyan, certain prayers cannot be said. The Torah can't be taken out and read, and Kaddish, which is a mourner's prayer, cannot be recited. My husband would usually be at shul, synagogue, in the early morning and evening every day of the week, so it has been strange to have him at home during these times. It was also difficult for him not to have his daily connection to his community. My sons live in Israel and were able to pray in a minyan from the balconies of the apartment building. Zoom meetings were started where one could pray with a group, but even though there may be more than 10 signed on, by Jewish law it does not count as a quorum. We approach our Jewish New Year in 2 months' time with uncertainty. We don't know if we will be able to pray together, and if not, how will we be able to ask forgiveness of our sins and pray for a sweet New Year? There is a simple parable that brings some comfort. In the 18th century, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezansk and his brother Rabbi Zusha would often dress as beggars to mingle with the masses and teach and guide when they could. They once got arrested with a band of vagabonds who were accused of thievery and thrown into jail. They sat quietly waiting to be released, but it came time to pray the afternoon service. Rabbi Elimelech got up to pray, but his brother reminded him he could not, as there was an open pail serving as a toilet, and the jail was therefore unfit to pray in. Dejected, Rabbi Elimelech sat down and cried. Rabbi Zusha responded, "Don't you know that the same God who commanded you to pray also commanded you not to pray in an unfit room? By not praying, you have achieved a connection with God. It's not the connection you sought, but God has given you the opportunity to obey his law, no matter what it is." "You are right, my brother," said Rabbi Elimelech, and he took his brother in his arms and began to dance from joy as he was still able to fulfill God's wishes. The guards heard the commotion, heard them singing out about the pail, and said, "So they're happy about the pail, we'll show them," and they promptly removed it from the cell. The brothers were now able to pray undisturbed, and once again were able to dance joyously. So the picture on the left is actually Rabbi Elimelech's grave, which is in a small town in Poland, and the picture on the right is just depicting the story. Okay, Sandringham Gardens Old Age Home went into lockdown very early. They could proudly boast that they were the only legal functioning minyan in the world. They were asked by Jews all over the world to name babies, which can only be done when a Torah is read, and say Kaddish in memory of those departed. For those in the home who could no longer see their families, this has been a huge boost and given them a great sense of purpose. We have experienced 2 Jewish holidays during lockdown, Pesach, which is Passover, and Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks. As a family, we were looking forward to our son and his new American wife traveling from Israel to join us, as well as her parents from America. The Passover Seder is a time when we all get together at long tables. We eat and sing and recount the Exodus from Egypt and the birth of the Jewish nation. This year it was just 3, my husband, daughter, and me. My parents made their own small Seder in their home, and no one was together. Before Passover, there was a lot of discussion among some rabbis who felt that the emotional toll of having a Seder for one was too harsh and would have a huge psychological impact. Some boldly recommended Zoom Seders, and many chose that option. However, as Orthodox Jews, we are unable to operate computers on our holy days, so we could not make use of this. We have been able to celebrate Zoom brisses, circumcisions, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, and weddings. Some have involved family and friends living overseas, and it's been great to have the facility to share in each other's celebrations. New innovations have been drive-by weddings where the bride and groom greet guests driving past them, or cars driven past a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah boy's house to send greetings. The photo here depicts a bride who's come to say hello to her grandmother on the day of her wedding at the old age home as she was unable to attend. Sadly, funerals have had to adapt as well. A recent Zoom funeral I watched, the rabbi asked for forgiveness of the deceased, as no formal tahara or ritual purification and cleansing was done on the body. Mourners cannot sit the usual 7-day shiva, where guests come and pay respect and offer comfort. This is replaced by calls and messages, while they often sit alone in their homes. When an Orthodox woman menstruates, she and her husband separate. She then counts 7 days after menstruation and immerses in a ritual bath or a mikvah. After immersion, the couple can resume a physical relationship. The mikvah has had to introduce strict standards to ensure safety of the women using them and of the women running them. Women can no longer come and prepare at the mikvah. They need to prepare at home, bring their own towels and gowns, etc., and keep their interaction at the mikvah to an absolute minimum. Women can no longer just arrive in the evening, but need to make an appointment so that they can be vetted in terms of COVID safety. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has put a stop to the important mitzvah, or good deed, of visiting the sick. We have innovated by dropping off food and gifts and WhatsApp calling. The saddest is those people in hospital without family visiting them. Those wards are so lonely, and the emotional impact on all is huge. We have always had a WhatsApp group where names of the sick are posted and we say Tehillim or Psalms in their names for healing. COVID has had a big impact on these groups, especially as the Gauteng numbers climb to their peak. It has been inspiring watching all the Jewish organizations come to the aid of our greater community, from offering interest-free loans for businesses in distress to food parcels to those in need and help with shopping for the elderly or those housebound. Hatzolah is an emergency response organization that initiated a wellness program. COVID-positive patients register with them, they get delivered a thermometer and pulse oximeter, and they are monitored twice a day. Nurses visit them at home when necessary, and their doctors are informed when their vital signs change. They also offer psychological support as the anxiety and loneliness that accompanies COVID-19 is immense. COVID is one of many plagues or pandemics that have affected the world, and I find it really interesting to compare our response to those that happened centuries before us. In the Old Testament, epidemics were seen as divine punishment for sin. God will choose who will live and who will die. The response was to plead for forgiveness and mercy with sacrifices and the burning of incense, and after the destruction of the first and second temple, with prayer and fasting. Tonight is Tisha B'Av, one of the saddest dates in the Jewish calendar. It's believed to be a day destined for tragedy. We remember, fast and mourn the destruction of both our temples, as well as other tragic events, like the return of the 12 spies that Moses sent out to Canaan, who reported negatively on the land, causing the children of Israel to complain and be punished by wandering in the desert for 40 years. Interestingly, the Torah describes a plague in the land of Canaan at the time, and the spies actually witnessed the Canaanites burying their dead. While the Jews are wandering in the desert, Korach stages a rebellion against Moses. He and 14,700 of his followers are killed by a plague. Aaron is able to bring a stop to the plague by burning incense. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Take the fire pan and put on it fire from the altar, add incense and take it quickly to the community and make expiation for them. For wrath has gone forth from the Lord, the plague has begun." The Italian Jewish community wrote a prayer during the height of their COVID-19 trauma, pleading for healing. In this prayer, they mention a description of the incense brought in the temple. The Ramban, or Nachmanides, a commentator in the early 1200s, wrote that the incense has unique powers and properties, such as the ability to abort a plague. Therefore, mention of the ketoret, or incense, burning invokes a form of protection against plague or epidemic disease. The Black Death or bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1346 from the east. It is not known if less Jews died from the plague than the general population, but it is thought that Jewish laws and practices, like washing hands on awakening and before eating, the quick burial of the dead, and the removal of grains from houses over Passover, all contributed towards better and safer living conditions. Sadly, Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells, and many were killed in various pogroms and attacks. This is a picture depicting an attack on Jews during the plague. This poem is inscribed on a tombstone in a Jewish cemetery in Toledo from a father to his son, and I think the same wording could be used on many new tombstones that will be erected in many cemeteries around the world. This stone is a memorial that a later generation may know that underneath it lies hidden a pleasant bud, a cherished child perfect in knowledge, a reader of the Bible, a student of Mishnah and Gemara, had learned from his father what his father learned from his teachers, the statutes of God and his laws. Though only 15 years in age, he was like a man of 80 in knowledge, more blessed than all sons. Asher, may he rest in paradise, the son of Joseph ben Turiel, may God comfort him. He died of the plague in the month of Tammuz in the year 1349. But a few days before his death, he established his home. But yesternight, the joyous voice of the bride and groom was turned to the voice of wailing, and the father is left sad and aching. May the God of heaven grant him comfort and send another child to restore his soul. Abraham Catalano was an Italian physician who wrote a book called Olam Hafuch, The World is Overturned or Upside Down, about a plague that gutted Italy in 1630 to 1631. He was one of 4 commissioned to oversee the health and welfare of the Jewish community in Padua. He describes how the leadership of the Jewish ghetto attempted to control the spread of the plague and continue with Jewish life. They instituted distancing measures, choosing to have services outside or to spread the men into the women's section of the synagogue to allow for more space.
5 minutes.
This is Glickel, a Jewish businesswoman of Hamel near Hamburg. She writes in her diary in the 1660s that her young daughter developed symptoms of the plague while visiting family in Hanover for Sukkot, which is the festival of tabernacles. The young girl was quarantined with a caregiver in a nearby village. Glickel writes how her husband took food for the festival to her. The young girl was so happy she wanted to run to her father, but they had to restrain her and her father as if with a rope to keep him from coming near. The husband and girl were both wailing, and he was so happy to see that she was safe and sound. I find this so interesting that all those years ago, the same emotions that we have experienced with COVID in 2020 were felt in the 1300s or the 1600s. The cause of infection may have changed, the epidemiology may differ, and the treatment may be more advanced, but we are all worried about our loved ones and our patients and trying our best to keep them safe. There is a lot to learn from past pandemics and Jewish leaders and doctors who manage them, but for me, these 2 quotes are the most important. The Rashbash is a medieval rabbi in the 1400s in Algiers. He wrote, "During a plague, one must be exceedingly careful, especially to wash themselves, not eat excessively, and eat small amounts of food that are high quality, and rest a lot while avoiding strenuous work, avoiding frustration while increasing joy. All of this to an extreme and not just a little bit." And this is from an anonymous Sephardi tractate. In times of pestilence, it is important to make an effort to avoid sadness, worry, and melancholy, and likewise anger, bad thoughts, and isolation. All these things arouse bad humors and burn up the good ones. Thus, it is critical to tilt to the other extreme and distance oneself from anger and bad things, while rejoicing in one's lot and giving praise to God for one's life, enjoying companionship, good music, and tranquility. We don't know how COVID-19 or any other new infection will play out in the months and years to come. It's hard to tolerate unpredictability and uncertainty. We cannot control what will happen next. Once we accept the reality that our sense of certainty and control is an illusion, once we understand and accept our inherent vulnerability, we acknowledge that God is ultimately in control and emerge with the inner strength to face crises with greater calmness and strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abraham. I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought. A few questions sprung to my mind, but we'll wait until our final speaker to engage with you and the rest of our Zoom audience. Now I call upon Dr. Shaima Al-Farsi from Kuwait. She's a nuclear medicine specialist, senior specialist, and she'll be talking about the Islamic perspective regarding the interaction between COVID-19 and the Islamic religion. Dr. Al-Farsi. Are you muted?
Am I muted?
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Okay, so these were great speeches. Thank you very much. And I'll be talking about the corona contagion in terms of Islamic perspective. And I will jump straight to Kuwait experience because the extensive talk about COVID-19 was excellent before. So the confirmed cases by WHO were exceeding 15 million. And Kuwait's population is 4 million. We have total cases of around 64,000, and the disease cases are 433. Although the Kuwait authority were able to apply the lockdown early by end of February, we still have this rising curve of cases, and that because some of the Kuwaitis flew back home from Iran, and at that time apparently it wasn't announced the number of cases in Iran. But then after 6 weeks, the death rate starting to grow slowly, and but they remained below 1,000. Thank God, and we hope it stops still there. Kuwait has great role in local and international contribution in stopping and battling the spread of COVID-19. And I would like to start off our beginning as humans when God created Adam in heaven. That was mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 30 to 33. He created Adam and taught him all the words, which means Adam learned the language. And then he created Eve, his wife, and that shows that us as humankind and Adam is a social creature. So after he warned Adam not to approach the tree, otherwise he'll be among the losers, that was mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 34 to 35. Adam acted out of his free will. And then the first punishment started. God sent Adam back to earth, sent Adam and his wife down to earth, expecting them to follow what God had taught Adam initially. But again, with the most kindness and the most generosity, when he sent them to earth, he was preparing Adam to survive on earth as he created him with a divine purpose. So Surah Al-Hajj mentioned that Allah subjected to us all that on earth, and even the ship that sails through the sea by command. And then the diversity of the creatures he created of different colors and mountains of different shades, as well as people and cattle. And then again in Surah Ghafir, verse 79 to 81, God created the cattle for us. Some of them we may use for riding and others for traveling, some for food and others for advantages for our use. So we are sharing this world with these animals and plants and other creatures, as we are not alone. So disaster or calamity is like causes a huge loss of life and properties, and there are two types: the natural disaster that we all know, and there are the man-made disaster, such as wars and utilization of nuclear and chemical weapons, industrial accidents, fires, and manufactured viruses that we're seeing more for the past few years. And speaking of God's punishment, God punishes after warning. God loves us and He never punishes us without warning. As I mentioned, Surah Hadith, verse 25, and Al-Baqarah, verse 230, Prophet Noah's people were punished by the floods. Prophets Hud and Salah's people were punished by strong wind and hurricanes. Prophet Shoaib's people or Jethro were punished by earthquake. And Prophet Moses' people, although they have nine clear evidence or signs, they ended up punished. Pharaoh was punished by drowning, and the criminal people and the arrogant people, God sent upon them floods, locusts, lice, frogs, and blood. But how about the human action and corruption? It's stated in Surah Ash-Shara, verse 30, whatever misfortune befalls you is of your own doing. God forgives much. And again in Surah Ar-Rahman, verse 6 to 9, God raised the heaven and set up the measures so that you should not transgress these measures. But is that what we're really doing? How about caring for ourselves and others? And how about the misuse and the abuse of the unlimited bounty to human? How about the ocean and animals and the landscape, the environment we live in? So plague has a quick history about plague. It started in 430 before Christ in the city of Athens, where Patra, and it was believed to be caused by Ebola virus. And then again in Antonia plague also was affected the Roman army and thought to be caused by smallpox. And the Justinian plague was the real pandemic, and it was spreading because of the military movement. So we see that human and war and the military movement was controlling or had a big role in these pandemics. In China, in 1334, Black Death occurred, and it was caused by bacteria of Oriental rats, which is pestis. And in 4 years or 3 years later, it moved to Europe. And the Spanish flu pandemic was a catastrophe where more of 50 million people were dead and caused by H1N1. In 2009, we have the swine flu. And then 5 years later, we have the Ebola outbreak. And then 4 years later, we have the COVID-19 through animal transition. Surah Ar-Rum stated that corruption has appeared on land and sea because of the evil which men's hands have done. And so he will make them taste the fruit of some of their doing, so that they may turn back from evil. Journey through the land and see how those before you met their end. Most of them ascribed partners with God. And this is what man's doing to the earth. And in early Muslim society, their perception about plague, which is called ta'un, and waba mainly means epidemic or pestilence, they believe that there is imbalance of the body humor caused by bad air. And what that means that the human body cannot accommodate to the new climate. And that's where it sparks plagues or pestilence, or maybe even caused by jinn. And when immigrants, Prophet Muhammad's companion, moved from Mecca to Medina, Abu Bakr and Bilal, they contracted a disease and got really sick. And they expressed their deep feeling through a poem where Abu Bakr described his deep feeling by contemplating his death, and Bilal contemplating by being homesick and missing Mecca. So it is okay to feel lost and to feel an anxiety and having all those nostalgia, but it's not okay to despair and lose faith in God. And Prophet Muhammad stated that plague is calamity, which was inflicted on those who were before you, or those upon Bani Israel. So when it has broken out in a land, do not run out of it. And when it has spread in the land, then do not enter it. So that's basically the concept of quarantine that in modern society now we're using. And that's exactly what Khalifa Umar followed the example of Prophet Muhammad during Syria plague. And the tradition of the Arabs back in Mecca is to send their children to a care of wet nurse until they reach the age of 5 or 6, just to avoid the death of plague or any illness. And that's what happened with Prophet Muhammad. When he was an infant, he was given to Halima Asadiya to be raised in the desert or the countryside, so he grew strong and healthy. And interestingly, mentioned that Medina, where Prophet Muhammad immigrated to, lived and died, remained secure of any pestilence. So in Islam places value of protection of life and health, and Prophet Muhammad advised this community to take care of their lives and lives of others. And what that means, like if we damage someone else's health or financial belongings, directly or indirectly, we violate their rightful due. And if we're infecting or spreading virus to someone, or this person has died because of the disease due to that virus, then we become responsible for their death. He also asked us to stay at home and protect ourselves from any deadly viruses or plagues. And he spoke about quarantine, and he forbid the contagious or infected people to mix with the healthy people. The famous saying of Prophet Muhammad, "None of you should wish for death due to calamity that has afflicted him," and urging Muslims to find legitimate and protective way to survive in his famous hadith. Pray for the healthy life and ability for good work, and pray for good faith and well-being, even under most dire circumstances. And his famous dua or supplication, God keep me alive so long as life is good for me, and cause me to die if death is better for me. And the Black Death in Egypt was here's say by Ibn al-Wardi, saying that acceptance does not mean failure to act, but when Muslim endures misfortune, then patience is his worship. And the reaction to the Black Death or recurrence of plague in Cairo was extra worship and more worship by praying and fasting more. And Muslims try their best to maintain their ritual purity by mass burial, turning to God, seeking repentance, enhancing goodness, and abandoning sinful acts. Increase more charity and dumping all alcohol in the river. Mosque also closes back then in Qayrawan, Tunisia, and Mosque of Andalusia. The closure was due to sickness, death, and taking care of the sick. Unlike today, the closure is the main cause for prevention. But both now and then, preoccupation with preservation of life was religiously valid. So people we know may succumb to disease or may pass away, the world may change, but the history will keep moving on. And how are we dealing with COVID-19? Of course, we fear getting sick, or we fear death, and we fear losing someone we love, or losing jobs, or even depression due to isolation. Prayer in Islam is constant in sickness and health, as it is a direct link with God. Friday prayers were mainly affected, And the value of communal prayer has higher rewarding than singular prayer, and mosques are closed for almost 3 months. Now the mosques are reopened, but with extreme caution. Only adults above 18 are allowed, but not elderly. Washing should be at home, and 2 meters distance is marked on the floor between prayers, which limits the number of prayers in the mosque. Prayers should bring their own mat from home, and mosque will be locked straight after performing the prayers. Collective Ramadan prayers that have passed, and Eid al-Fitr prayer passed, and we were all in lockdown. Regarding burials, communal worship value the attendance of burial prayers for the loved ones, and COVID-19 has affected the public gathering. It's only allowed for first-degree relatives, and no condolence visits to the deceased family was allowed. Weddings were stopped. Hajj is about to come, but Umrah was seized at that time. Saudi authorities originally approved 1,000 pilgrims to attend the Hajj, of which 30% of them are Saudis, but they updated their 10,000 pilgrims because of the application process for approval. All pilgrims were tested for COVID, and they will be given safety kits, masks, sanitizer, and special prayer mats. The distance should be 5 feet between communal prayers and while circling around Kaaba. After pilgrimage, all of the prayers will be quarantined for 2 weeks. The implications we've seen in our society of two types. Kindness, which is righteous act mentioned in Surah Fussilat, verse 46. And we see that in terms of us loving our family, taking care of them, and keeping family ties alive. That was mentioned in Surah Nisa, verse 1. But that was happening by online communication, which is a great privilege again. And so social solidarity was mentioned in Medina, in Surah Al-Medina, verse 2, stating that help one another in righteousness and piety, but help no one in sin or rancor. Fear Allah, for Allah is strict in punishment. We saw social solidarity in terms of volunteer work. Young people were making face masks, face shields, and tracking applications for those who were quarantined at home. They also lowered the rental rates for tenants. Loans also were postponed to help people not to get stressed over their debt. And online support was seen by healthcare and dietitians, psychologists, artists, and even fitness trainer. On the other hand, we saw human greed and corruption, hoarding of medical materials and goods in supermarkets, a lack of investment in the healthcare, price gouging, and insistence of keeping shops open just for the sake of large corporations. So God mentioned in Surah Fussilat, verse 42, God is never in the least unjust to his creature, and that's what we saw with the prejudice toward Chinese. But the way to cope with that is for the authority and the rules, stay safe and keep our distance and frequent washing to protect ourselves, and then having faith in Allah. We should have more worship by praying, supplication, and fasting, and more virtual religious activities like what we're doing now, and increasing interaction and outreach around the world. And not to forget the online charity. Surah Al-Zumar, God says in verse 53, O my servants who have committed excess against their own soul, do not despair of God's mercy, for God surely forgives all sins. He is truly the most forgiving, the most merciful. And Surah Al-A'raf, verse 180, God has the most excellent names. Call on him by his names and keep away from those who distort them. they shall be requited for what they do. And Surah Rahman, God says, all on earth perishes, and the face of your Lord, honor of majesty and honor persists. And I would like to mention that despite of losing the ones we love, and we losing close people and relatives or even friends, but some people got the chance to build up small businesses online, and they're getting like even closer and reaching out in the world. I would never talk in a webinar with you guys if it wasn't for these occasions. And let's not forget, there are some benefits of natural disaster and temporary season of human activity, because we're not living alone in this world. The ecosystem has to be balanced in one way or another. And for a great hope, the Arctic opening in the ozone layer appeared after 2011, that was never seen, but recently seen in March 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Farsi. I'm sure there's going to be many questions.
You're still screen sharing.
Yeah, no, I'm getting rid of that. Okay. All right, stop share. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the three panelists. We need to thank them, wave at them for giving us good insights into the various perspectives from the three faiths. I want to kick off this hour-long discussion quickly with the three brief questions to our speakers. I'll start with Dr. Woodman. You come from an evangelical Christian background, so how do you think that the Christian fundamentalists today are explaining this coronavirus?
So I'm just checking that I'm unmuted. I'm definitely unmuted. So that's why I think I couldn't do this talk without at least mentioning, the Book of Revelations and the notion of a very apocalyptic vision of the world, and it's not in a I think all three of us have mentioned our relationship with the world and how we have as human beings done an injustice to the earth, and that is part of the problem of why we are having this pandemic. I think there's no doubt about it. But the Christian apocalyptic vision is that we should simply sit back and let despair and let the contagion run through the earth and eradicate what they would see as that which is bad, and they see it as God's will. So it's not a vision that I can accept as part of my own belief. But the talk and the way in which COVID-19 is seen as part of an end of the world scenario has been part of that evangelical discussion and discourse. Together with it, there has been calls for, let's engage in more prayer, let's call upon God for divine mercy, but it has been seen very much in terms of divine judgment and an end of world case scenario. So from that is from the very, very conservative, very evangelical strand of Christianity. But then, of course, you have a lot of Christians in between. You have a lot of mainstream Christians, and of course, you have very progressive Christians on the other end of the spectrum.
Thank you. And now to Dr. Abrams. I was really impressed with your talk. It's very illuminating and informative for me as a non-Jew. But what I wanted to know is, you obviously, and I respect that, come from an Orthodox background. So how do the Reformed Jews, I know it's difficult for you to speak on behalf of them, but how do they look at the Mishnah and the Talmud? Would they follow it to the same degree regarding you, especially in terms of the Jewish response to the coronavirus?
Unmute.
Unmute, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, unmute all now. All right. Okay. Okay.
I must be honest, I couldn't even comment. I wouldn't know. I don't know. It's not my place to even say what they believing or what they're looking at, because I really wouldn't know at all.
Because the way you described it, and I'm very impressed with that. You know, this whole there's the rules, regulations, and so forth. I'm just curious, would they do the same in terms of coronavirus? I'm not talking about other things. Would they follow the same type of response that the Orthodox community has?
What do you mean in terms of?
Practicing their faith. And for example, you mentioned that you can't have services unless you have X amount of male worshippers and so forth. Would they do the same thing?
Look, I think they kind of loosen the restrictions a lot more. So I think so. Yeah, I think it's a very similar.
Maybe we have a Reform liberal-minded Jewish member in our audience tonight, and maybe he or she will comment on that. And I understand you can't do that. And let me turn to Dr. Al-Farsi again. An interesting presentation, but you mentioned something about Chinese prejudice. But my issue with the Chinese government is that these people, I call them tyrants there, because what they've done with Tibet, what they have done with the Uyghur Muslims, what they have done in Hong Kong and so forth, these people have refused to admit responsibility for this virus. They pretend it's not even from there. So how can we now, and that's part of the reason why so many people, and I have to be honest, including myself, are really upset with these people, because if you admit you've done something wrong, then clearly people will be happy to and willing to forgive you. But if the Chinese have said nothing, taken no responsibility for this whatsoever, no wonder there's a growing prejudice against the Chinese. And that verse that you quoted actually doesn't really relate to this, because if someone is truly contrite and apologetic, then yes, God will forgive. But if not contrite, not remorseful, and pretend it's nothing to do with you, how can the Creator or anyone else forgive you?
I totally agree with you, Dr. Taj. Even my kids are mad with the Chinese a little bit. Let's have a perspective here. There are lots of Chinese around the world. They're doctors and they're lawyers, and they're living in America and they're living in England. It is not these people who we should hate. It's the acts that what the government is doing, or like the people who are like causing the suffering to other people. But we cannot blame civilians who had nothing to do or haven't been living in China just because of their appearance and they got bullied.
Okay, that's a fair response. Okay, open to anyone now. Just raise your hands or wave or whatever the case you need to do, and I'll ask you to come in and ask a direct question at any of the speakers or all three of them. Who's first to go? Don't be shy.
Yeah. Hi. Can I just ask a quick question? I can't find my hand raising icon on this iPad. Yeah. This is just to Dr. Al-Farsi actually. So do you have any idea how they're going to quarantine? I think you said 10,000 pilgrims to Hajj. I mean, do you know where they're going to quarantine them for 2 weeks afterwards? Because it sounds like one of these, events that could be, what we call sort of a super infectious kind of hub that infection can spread across the world from it. Are they quarantining in Saudi or in their own home countries?
No, it's going to be, I think, in Saudi. It's going to be in Saudi. And then for Kuwait specifically, I don't know about the other country, Kuwait specifically will quarantine again for another 10 days in the country when they come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's open up now. Not that I have the speakers and the panelists speaking and myself. Anyone else out there want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Yeah,
or
can
a comment?
can I say something?
Yes,
It's
Najib.
Sarah here. Regarding the attitude of people towards the Chinese people, I think we have to make a very clear distinction between the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and the people of China. And I think the two are completely different.
Yes, they're completely different, but remember also the average Chinese, I haven't met any Chinese person in the UK, and I know quite a few Chinese, would actually put their heads up and say, listen, I'm sorry this has come from my country. They're not personally responsible, I agree, but how many Chinese people, even though those expatriates living abroad, actually say publicly, listen, it's wrong what our government is doing. So where's, I need some denunciation of the Chinese tyrants. If there's no denunciation, I don't know how all they're individually responsible, but if they're living, especially in a free country, you have Chinese, British people, you have, Chinese people in Vancouver or wherever, why don't they speak out more? I haven't heard anything.
I would suspect because of the type of government they have, they are probably quite wary of saying anything.
Well, then again, also say in private, Sarah. Okay, we should
well,
stop
I don't
making
know any
excuses
private
for them.
ones.
Taj, it's Syra.
Yes,
Just wanted to say, I mean, the same thing was asked of, was expected of Muslims when 2001 happened and the towers fell down.
Yeah, and we said no. And we said no.
And we said no.
We said no.
Yeah.
We did say no. Okay,
Yeah.
so yes, I'm not responsible for Osama bin Laden, neither are you. But when they do things in the name of Islam, then we do come up and say no, not in our name. The Chinese, especially the Chinese abroad, and those who are never going back there, should say, listen, no, not in our name. The government should be honest and tell us what really, really happened. No one actually knows what happened.
Okay.
Can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Regarding of what happened in that incident, September 11. Now, there is this misconception about Islam where we cannot judge religion by their extremists. Religion will never be judged fairly with their extremists. And what's happening in the name of Allah, the name of Allah is like much more like in peace and serenity than their actions. In fact, the greeting in Islam is Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, means may peace be upon you with God's mercy and blessing. This is what Islam, that's what Islam means. Islam means peace and surrender to God. So the extremists, when they act, they don't represent me as a Muslim. I represent myself by manners, because Islam is all about manners. And that's what Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, before he died, he said, I was sent to you, God, to complete all the religion and complete all the good manners. We represent Islam by manners and modesty rather than being extremists. There is no corruption is allowed in Quran.
Right, let's move on to any other questions, comments, please.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Good evening. I'm from India.
Yes.
And my name is Wes Aslam. Thank you very much. My question is open to the panelists that a few months ago we noticed a trend that Jews and Muslims were wrongfully being accused of spreading this disease across the world. And my question is that what do you think is the role of the other religions in trying to counter this hate narrative?
For who is this question?
I think it's for all of. I think it's for all of us.
All right, go for it.
Please.
I didn't get the question.
He will never leave those who are faithful, and he'll always guard them. The seed of the evil ones will be cut off. Look ahead in Pasuk Lamed Bet. Shofet Rasha Latzadik.
Okay, the man from India, can you repeat your question, please? Hello? Okay, I don't know what happened to him. Is there anyone else who's got some relevant point to make or contribution? Luke, do you want to ask something?
Taj, can I ask something, please?
Who's this?
It's Mphala.
Mphala, go for it, please.
Hi. Yes, I mean, firstly, I'd really like to thank our three speakers for, wonderful presentations. And again, I was struck by the similarities between the three perspectives, the Unitarian Christian, the Jewish, and the Islamic. I was also struck by how, your comparison of early responses to plagues in the 14th century or before, and now it seems like we're still responding in the same way, primarily blaming God, that God is punishing us without focusing on what are we being punished for. So I'd like to ask the speakers, is the emphasis correct, has the emphasis changed in terms of blaming God versus us saying these are the natural consequences of our collective actions? Okay,
Dr. Abrams, will you go first?
Yeah, what I'd like to comment on is one of our rabbis, Rabbi Soloveitchik, always used to talk about when something bad happened, there's two responses you can have to it. You can say, for why did this happen? And the Hebrew word for that is lama, why did this happen? Or you can take that same Hebrew word and you can turn it into lama, for what did this happen? And I think there's no ways we can find reasons, and plenty of people have pointed fingers and said it was because of this and we do this and we're bad and I don't think that has got any relevance, because what we do and how we move forward from this is so much more important than blame and pointing fingers at what might have been the cause of it before.
Good. Dr. Woodman?
Yeah, so I certainly think that among some elements of some of the religious groups, there is still this idea that we are being punished because of the notion of wrongdoing. But I think certainly from maybe the more progressive sides of all of the faith groups, I think the notion that we bear responsibility for what we've created, and whether that is because of our population density across the globe, because of the way in which we farm and how we manage wildlife and how we manage spaces, and how we manage the climate change on the planet. I think there is now a much more clearer acknowledgement that we bear our own responsibility. And I think if there's one thing that I'd like to see coming out of COVID-19 is some sort of linkage with the campaign for climate change that had been very high on the agenda before COVID-19 took over. So prior to COVID-19, the climate change agenda was really up there. I think people were getting on it, and then because of COVID-19, it's essentially gone onto the back burner. But the two are invariably linked, I think, as Dr. Al-Farsi was pointing out. The two are so intimately linked that where it comes from is not that much of an issue, but how it is caused, I think that is the issue. And I think, and this is linked to our behaviors, it's linked to our attitude to the natural world, it's linked to our rampacious attitude to how we see our right to inhabit this world, both in terms of business activity, leisure activity, our right to farm as we wish, and our right to despoil the earth as we wish. And we think there's no consequences to this. So I know that sounds like a really, really wide-ranging issue, but actually, we've had the climate change on the agenda. Now we've got COVID-19 on the agenda. To see this as separate issues, I just think that there needs to be a holistic approach to it. And that's why I think we are bearing the consequences of our actions to a certain extent. And if we think back to the historical responses in terms of, for example, the plague in 13th century, 14th century Europe, you know, the reason, and also from Dr. Al-Farsi's presentation, the reason that people sent their children out of densely populated areas was because the population density caused the spread of these contagions, right? So if we haven't learned the lesson about densely populated areas not being a good thing and poor hygiene not being a good thing, then when are we going to learn that particular lesson? Because it's a very, very simple lesson to learn. I think Dr. Al-Farsi is going to probably say something as well.
Yeah. What I said is like God punishes after warning, and that only happened back in those days in Prophet Noah and Prophet Moses and Jesus, Lut and Saleh. Now we cannot say that God punishing us because we don't have these prophets to tell us, because they were the direct link to God. We cannot assume what God is doing, but we have the evidence that God stated in the Holy Quran, in which like whatever good comes is from God, and whatever evil comes is from ourselves. And in Surah Shara, verse 30, whatever misfortune befall you is of your own doing. God forgives much. And that's what we keep happening of corrupting and transgressing God's measures with all these explosion and the virus manufacturing. And basically what is Dr. Wood is saying, it's all of our own act.
Thank you. Okay, any further comments, questions, please? Don't be, Michael Alurit out there, please, Michael.
Fergus O'Connor. I'm Fergus.
Hi, Fergus.
Unitarian minister.
Okay.
I wanted to thank all of the speakers, and there's a certain Quaker expression, this speaks to my condition, and what Dr. Woodman said in particular spoke to my condition. At the heart of all the world great religions, I'm a member and secretary of the World Congress of Faiths, it's the golden rule to treat neighbors, others, as you would have them treat you. And I think that what has happened with this virus and what is happening in the world now with the evil of President Trump populism and the leader of Brazil is that we see that this has brought out the best and the worst in humanity, and we need a certain humility of where we've gone wrong. We have to treat our neighbors as we have them treat ourselves. That is at the heart of all the great religions. And for example, Rabbi Hillel said, what is hateful to you, you do not do to others. And it is in Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. And one other thing that struck me particularly, what Dr. Woodman was saying as well, is that how we treat the natural world and our fellow creatures. Because all sentient beings are creatures of our common creator, and how we treat the earth. And I think that we must have to learn these lessons. And I think we need a certain humility. But I certainly think it's been very, very dangerous what President Trump has done and the President of Brazil. We have seen the worst type of populism in the way they have turned on the poor. It's really appalling. And we have to learn that lesson of universal charity to all our fellow beings, and unless we learn that, I think things will get worse. So I wanted to thank all the speakers, and it's interesting we have women doctors, caring people, and you have seen the need for treating suffering people. We don't want more people suffering, so we've got to learn the lessons, haven't we?
Thank you for your comment. I don't know if it requires a response or not, but I think you made very profound statements about every established religion, you know, East and West, always talking about loving one's neighbor, being kind to others. do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you. And I think that's a universal message. It's common to every faith, every philosophy, and we all should embrace it with alacrity. Any further questions, comments out there, please, guys? Wendy, since you've arranged the speaker, you can't just sit there. Maybe you could give us Wendy, by the way, for those who don't know, Wendy Khan, she's Executive Director, I believe, of the South African Board of Jewish Deputies. And she's played a crucial role in recruiting Dr. Abraham, who gave a fantastically informative presentation. So I really thank you for that. But now you need to earn your keep as well and give us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the points that have been made are just so apt, that there's just so much similarity and there's so much commonality in what we've all been going through, and the suffering that all of our communities have had, where we have not been able to be in our places of worship. We've been removed from our communities. Our celebrations and our sad times have been lonely and depressing, and I think it's just such a wonderful opportunity for us all to come together and be able to really share in that, in our experiences, and take some comfort, I suppose, from our holy books and our holy traditions. And thank you so much for arranging this. I think it's just been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for us to be involved in this. And thank you to our speaker, Joanne, Dr. Joanne, for having represented our community so well, and it's so wonderful to listen to the other speakers from the Muslim community and the Christian community. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us.
Okay, we still have about 20 minutes, unless we need to close early, but I think we have enough.
So can I just ask something? It's something that I haven't been able to elaborate on, but I think one of the issues that none of the faith communities are quite gearing up for is the pastoral care that's going to be needed for what I call the survivors of COVID-19. You know, the people that have actually made it through, whether it's through bereavement or whether it's actually through being survivors from very, very, shall I say, distressing conditions on ITU units. I think there isn't a grasp within the faith communities at the moment, because everybody's just grappling with the current present crisis. But there isn't a grasp within the faith communities about how do we ramp up our pastoral care within our communities for the survivors who's going to come out with quite traumatic experiences. I haven't seen that happening within the wider Christian community. I haven't seen it happening within the evangelical right. I haven't seen it happening within the Anglican Church, for example. And I can understand the reason why. The churches have only just recently been opened. But I was just wondering if anybody, or my two fellow speakers, if they are aware about whether there is some kind of thinking happening about how do we deal, and this won't be a short-term issue, how do we deal with the long-term post-traumatic stress that's going to come out from all the people who's been through all of the suffering. And my feeling is either they are going to lose their faith, because they will say my faith is coming up short on this, or their faith will deepen. But I think pastoral care is going to become a huge issue, and I'm just interested in whether anything is happening in the other communities.
Go for it,
Joanne.
Yeah, so we're in Johannesburg at the moment, and we're not even at our peak yet, because our numbers haven't started dropping yet. So we don't even know when our peak is coming. So up until now, we have really been dealing with the crisis and the build up towards it in terms of acute management. For the first time this week, I've started seeing patients with the chronic cough, with the chronic fatigue post-COVID. You know, those that have recovered and are now presenting post-COVID with all these manifestations of what they've experienced. So I think, yes, definitely that's an excellent point, and it's something we need to start now putting into process when we need it. I know in terms of the doctors in our local clinic and hospital have been really good in terms of making sure patients in intensive care are getting, those that are verbal are getting psychological therapy. There's psychologists going in full PPE and speaking to the patients, and they acknowledge that it is such an important part of recovery is dealing with the mental side of the whole crisis.
Dr. Alpert, you want to comment on the provision of pastoral care and dealing with people emerging and surviving COVID-19? How will the Muslim community deal with them? What type of support structure would they provide?
Well, in the field of medicine, I'm not working with the COVID team currently, and I'm sure they're getting all the help they need in terms of medical support. But in other terms, I haven't really dealt with it. Maybe someone who had experience in it can talk about it better.
Well, we certainly have, I mean, in the UK, there's actually been an increase, which nobody ever thought there'd been an increase in chaplains and imams and priests in the hospital chaplaincies, but there's actually been an increase in numbers in chaplaincy in the UK. So although I don't think it will fulfill all of the needs of people, I think it will have to come from the faith communities themselves in providing some of that psychological support, because people will want to go somewhere. So in the UK, the chaplaincies have increased in the hospitals.
Can I just add to that, Jackie?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for bringing up. Yeah, thank you very much for bringing up the mental health aspect. We are already seeing. I work in mental health, primarily in children and adolescents, and we're already seeing an increased demand for services. Not even directly linked to COVID, but as a consequence of the isolation and the social restrictions. And there is no doubt that mental health has always been underfunded relative to the other disciplines. So I think pastoral care is going to be even more important, because there's no way that mental health professionals are going to cope with the demand. There's always been a huge gap between the supply and demand. But also, let's not forget the mental health of the carers. There was a very interesting program on, I think it was BBC on one of the channels, where they were interviewing ICU nurses, and they were saying that if we get a second wave of COVID, they didn't think that they would have the same resilience and psychologically to manage a second wave of patients. So the pastoral care definitely is going to be more important. And there is quite a lot of information and resources online, sort of self-help resources, and that's what we tend to do, is to refer and divert patients to self-help resources.
And can I just echo that about ITU staff? And I don't know if Jan, if you're going to be having the same issue. Our ITU consultants, I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist, and I'm not an ITU specialist, but our ITU specialists, they're pretty hardy individuals. These are people who deal with patients who may die very easily, and they deal with death all of the time. And I had a colleague come up to me and say, he says, we were never trained to allow someone to die in full PPE, not being able to even touch their hand, skin to skin, right? Because doctors are taught, touch is the first thing that you will do with your patient. You will take them by the hand, or you will examine them, and you will touch them. Well, in the current COVID-19 situation, we are all gloved and everybody's wearing full PPE. That human touch is totally missing from a patient who is dying in a hospital bed. And I totally agree that the ITU specialists are probably the people at the cutting edge. I deal with COVID-19 patients mainly on the ward. But that loss of human touch has become a theme throughout the medical profession, because doctors are trained to touch people, physically touch them. It's how you make a diagnosis. It's how you manage people. So that loss of touch has certainly made it very difficult for healthcare professionals across the board, whether it's healthcare workers or doctors or nurses or midwives, made it very, very difficult for them to have that human interaction that is just supposed to be part of medicine. And I think we'll probably be seeing mental health issues coming from their responses as well.
Okay, Siti, I think you wanted to ask a question or comment there.
Hi, Siti. You need, yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for all the wonderful speakers. Thank you very much for this evening, and Dr. Taj as well. I agree with everything that's been said already, but I just feel, as a human being, if one has gone through COVID, or even not gone through COVID, but seen other people through it, it would be nice if we could not separate ourselves with our religions, and if anybody needs any care, even though we can't touch, we have the words that touch, and you know, English or whatever language universally could help patients or people in crisis or in need, by just talking to them, whether Muslim talks to a Christian, or you know, even different faith leaders talking to people who are not of that faith, can all have the same, because they all have the same feeling towards getting better, God, even to an atheist even. I just think if we cut ourselves up into little bits like religions, there might be a barrier, because maybe we can't get to see an imam or a priest or a rabbi. I just think there should be more connection between the faiths.
Anyone wants to take that up?
Can I just say, so yeah, I totally agree with you, Siti. I think from the point of view of human connection, I think what's been interesting in the UK is that the UK is a very secularized environment. You know, the majority of British people will actually not affiliate with a particular church or a particular chapel, and would actually consider themselves quite secular. And I think what COVID-19 has done, it has just cut across the barriers of religion anyway, because most people don't go to church, or, you know, some people don't go to mosque, they don't go to temple, they don't go to synagogue, just because they are highly secularized. So I think in terms of one-to-one individual contact, I've had more contact with people in my street than I've ever had in the 26 years that I've been living in the street. Okay, and nobody cares whether I mean, there's 3 churches around where I live. I've never been in any of those particular churches because I go to my own chapel. But nobody actually cares which church you go to, or which synagogue you go to, or which mosque you go to, when people are interacting in the streets and across fences and across neighbors. So almost that early 20th century kind of communication and neighborliness has come back to a certain extent, in that you are now having conversations across your garden fence. Bearing in mind the UK government imposed a 1 meter rule on either side of their garden fence at the height of lockdown. So I think that does happen. But I think where the different faith groups are needed is in particular in the ritualistic side of worship. Now, I don't come from a strand of my faith or my current faith where it is incredibly ritualistic. In fact, Unitarians pride themselves on not being particularly ritualistic, but there are a few rituals that I think everybody feels a need to be part of which things within the Christian tradition would be things like baptism, weddings, funerals, and for a lot of churches, communion, you know, the taking of communion together. And that happens within that particular faith group. I think Joanne was highlighting how important certain ritualized acts is for Jews. And I think Dr. Al-Farsi was highlighting, for example, the Hajj. You know, I personally, as a non-Muslim, and I shouldn't be saying this to Muslims, I personally feel that the Hajj should have been cancelled, right? But it is such a highly ritualistic, communal endeavor within one particular faith group that I think each faith will simply have to deal with their own rituals and their own very specific activity separately. I think that can't be gotten around in a certain way. But I think at an individual level, I totally feel that COVID-19 has actually made us cross religious boundaries more so than we had for any other disaster, if you want to call it that, in the past. I don't know how the other speakers feel.
Yeah, let me ask Dr. Abraham. So Siti's question was, should we be dissecting us and dividing ourselves in religion at this time of crisis, or shouldn't we all come together? How do you feel about that, what she's suggesting?
I think it comes back to what I said before. We all are in the same boat, and we all can help each other in any way we can. And by coming together, and the good neighborliness, I think is so much more important. You know, when you go out to the shops and you're wearing a mask over your face and you see someone you sort of know, usually you would like smile or something. They can't see that. So you actually have to make an effort to acknowledge them so that you are creating a connection with the mask on your face. And in a way, it does create even more communication. I mean, in my area, which is mainly a Jewish area, over the weekend, I mean, I look out at my office sometimes and I just see people walking up and down the streets, which before they would be in their cars going off somewhere, but now they're just going for a walk because they need to just get out. And they all stop and chat and carry on and stop and chat. And it has created a great sense of community. Even just standing in a line outside a shop to go inside, you end up chatting to the person. You know, it's a commonality that we're all going through, and we all have this shared commonality. And to acknowledge that with whoever you're with just creates intimacy more.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Farsi, sorry, I just want Dr. Al-Farsi, then you can come in. Dr. Al-Farsi, what do you say about this cities question?
I agree with Dr. Abrams. Like for that, when they during lockdown, they gave us like 2 hours curfew free. So we were walking around in the neighborhood, and it was the most amazing 2 hours in the day. You know, just getting out, seeing people. Even like it was hard walking out in the hot weather with masks and distancing, but it feels like a pleasure walking around and seeing people out in the streets, because like we haven't seen people. And actually, like, it is very worrying, especially for the children and the kids, you know, to be like antisocial after that long time of lockdown.
Okay, thank you. There was someone asking a question. Who was that?
I was just going to say something. So, sorry, so thank you very much to everybody who answered my question. I was just saying that, I lost it now. That I understand why people need rituals in order to feel safe and protected. But funnily enough, if you look at it, COVID-19 has disbanded rituals somewhat. If you take, for instance, people who were used to wearing the hijab, yashmak, people were ridiculing them for wearing that. Now everybody's wearing a face mask across their face like that. So they have to accept it, which is a nice thing. I think it just shows that anybody can wear a face mask, anybody can wear a hijab if they want to, and there should be no ridicule. I guess I don't know about funerals, because funerals are supposed to be in a religious context. They have to be a certain way with prayers. We can't, because there's so many people who have died during the COVID. People get stacked up and they don't have the time to do the rituals. Who knows, there might even be cremations. I don't know in the future. And I don't know, in Islam, Dr. Taj, you're not supposed to have cremation.
No, the Quran doesn't actually say you can't have it. This is what what the clergy have come on.
Yeah. So, you know, that sort of thing. So sometimes the pandemic can get rid of barriers within religion.
Can I just come in on that? And it's about ritual. So I totally agree. Now everyone has to wear a mask, but I just would like to highlight, and I know we're coming up to almost the end of the session, and the last thing I want to do is introduce a totally different subject. But I am going to introduce a different subject, which is that of gender discrimination. So yes, I agree, COVID-19 has actually made us pretty gender equal in that men and women have to wear a face mask. And when COVID-19 is over, then in terms of the customary dress code, if certain sections of the community suggest that only women need to have their face covered, I'd like to see the men covering their faces as well. Okay, so the face mask, I'm sorry, for COVID-19 is an infection control issue. The customary wearing of women only masking their face is a sexist imposition. So COVID-19's face masking has got nothing to do with customary clothing. And the ritual that I'm referring to is that, yes, there are certain ritualistic practices that goes with every faith group, and actually people have been engaging in it. Firstly, they've been barred from engaging in it in the way that they could have, and we've seen the pictures both from Dr. Al-Farsi and the one that I showed as well, and the one that Dr. Abraham showed, about funerals not being able to be attended. And within each of the faith groups, the commonality is that you say goodbye to a loved one. I mean, this is a very human thing. You see it in primates. You see it in primates where they actually physically touch the body of the dead to say goodbye, to acknowledge a life that's been lived. Okay, you don't see it in other parts of the animal kingdom, but you specifically see it in primates and in human beings, and we are all primates. And so that ritual has been, as far as I'm concerned, eviscerated by COVID-19. And what has happened, of course, is we've felt the need so much for the saying goodbye ritual that it has moved online to a certain extent. But the human touch is missing from that. People are not allowed to touch their loved ones, which is an acknowledgement that this person existed, this person lived, and this person shared the earth with us. And that is a very, very primate ritual, which you can argue that it is not specifically linked to faith, but faith has stepped in, and faith groups have made their very particular way of saying that, of making that ritual specific for them, but it is a primate ritual. And that won't be done away with. People will always feel the need for certain rituals, welcoming a life into the earth and saying goodbye to a life as it leaves our world. That is a ritual that will cut across all barriers.
Okay, we got Kasim there. Kasim, you got the question or comment?
Thanks, Doc. Thank you to all the doctors for all the very informative and insightful talks and presentations. I think medicine historically has always, in some way, shape, or form, been part of all of our faiths and beyond. And in Islam, particularly, we pride ourselves on Islam's contribution some 1,000 years ago or so. My question is, why is there such a reluctance for all the doctors, for all three of the doctors? Why is there such a reluctance for doctors to step outside of the box and consider possibilities outside of their allopathic education? And I understand that there are regulations and there's fear of being ostracized in the medical fraternity, etc. But all of our religions promotes preservation of life. So the question is, what is our religious duty when there is evidence or potential evidence of treatments that could save lives outside of the norm of what doctors consider the norm in general, to actually investigate, interrogate, maybe even become activists for those treatments if they've researched it themselves and strongly believe that there might be a possibility for it to save more lives. For example, there's a case where it was my case where I insisted the doctor puts my mother on the highest dose of vitamin C in hospital. He was reluctant, and he was a specialist. He was reluctant. I asked him, is it going to kill my mother? He said no. I said, then at least you and I know that we've tried everything to save her life and to give her every possible chance of fighting this disease. So eventually agreed to put my mother on 4,000 milligrams every 6 hours. There was a marked improvement for a while. I later learned that some other doctor, I don't know which doctor it was, someone reduced that dosage back to 1,000 milligrams every 4 hours intravenously, for example, intravenously. And it's, while I don't have the exact evidence, but it seemed to correlate with my mother's decline in health again, which eventually led her to succumb. But the point is if there is evidence, and there are journals spanning for over 50 to 70 years for alternative treatments, as doctors of faith, as Muslim doctors, as Jewish doctors, as Christian doctors, is it not our duty, or your duty, sorry, I'm not a doctor, your duty to actually search for anything possible to preserve that life? I think the gist is, you got the gist of my question. Thanks.
Okay,
and
so
thank you.
I'll get Dr. Farsi, then Dr. Abrams and Dr. Woodman to answer that. Dr. Farsi?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can understand. The thing is, like, for doctors, they cannot try things on patients unless there's like evidence-based, or like they've done research somewhere and they approve a protocol. But that's my understanding to the question. But if I go blindly and try things that I personally think is okay, I have to have evidence that this thing is work before I try it on on sick patients. Otherwise, they go through like meta-analysis, and they go with consent of group of patients to let them try on medication or new medication. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Abrams, thinking outside of the box, according to Kasim?
Look, I think I agree with Dr. Alfasi. You know, there's so much research out there and everything changes all the time. And what treatment was being used a few months ago is now not being used. So it is a very fluid disease that we're treating, and it's a very difficult. I think what also is happening is that so many people have researched and looked into treatments themselves, non-medical people, family members, and it's such a hard call. I mean, as you're telling me the story of the vitamin C, I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who was begged by family to put a specific patient onto a specific treatment. And this doctor was really reluctant, and they got the cousin who's a specialist from overseas to speak to this doctor. And eventually it was agreed, and the patient was put on this medication, and then the patient had a stroke the next day. So this doctor was telling me, like, is this because they use the medication? Is it not? You know, you just don't know. And that's why it's so important to stick with research, because research is there for a reason, to get finite answers as to what is happening. And we can't treat people anecdotally. We just can't.
Okay. Dr. Woodman?
Yeah, I can only echo what both of my colleagues are saying. So I mean, the first rule of any doctor is first do no harm. And I think if we could maybe just think how we're going to extrapolate this on, for example, to the new vaccine which is being developed in Oxford. And I just want you to think about what I'm going to say next, and how we actually make sure that what we are treating, we are not doing more harm to the patient. Now, certainly when it comes to something that we think it won't do any harm, but it won't do any good, there would still be caution in using something like that, because what you are doing is that you are putting in an intervention, making somebody think that you are doing something for them, when it is not necessarily the case. So in a way that is dishonest practice. It's like me telling somebody who I know is maybe being not faking a disease, but feeling that, if I give them an injection, it doesn't matter what's in the injection, they'll get better. And there's a placebo effect. I can give them an injection of just water and they'll feel better. That doesn't mean that they've actually become better. It simply means that about 20 to 40% of most interventions that we do in medicine has this effect where the patient becomes better anyway. And sometimes you do things and the patient becomes worse anyway. So if we follow the first rule is first do no harm, we cannot give things that have not been shown with some level of evidence.
We've lost you.
Okay. Sorry.
Carry on.
And also on the other side of the coin, we cannot give medications which, although it might not do any harm, we leave patients under the impression that somehow they're doing good when we have no evidence to support it. That is being dishonest. It does not mean that we can't try things that have got a reasonable chance of success. Now, the problem with COVID-19, and this is something that every clinician is now struggling with, I think across the world, is that we have got a really, really poor grasp of this virus. Okay, this virus, although it is an aerosol conducted virus that attacks the respiratory system initially, the effects is not on the respiratory system alone. The effects appear to be on the immune system. So I don't have a gripe with vitamin C. I agree, vitamin C, great for the immune system. But it has an effect on the microvasculature of the body. It gives acute cardiac injury. It gives an acute, what they call a cytokine storm, which is where all of the inflammatory proteins are released in the system, and it destroys the blood vessels, especially small blood vessels. And this is where we think the risk of thrombosis comes in, DVTs and pulmonary emboli come in. And it seems to attack the linings of certain organs, and this is where interstitial lung injury comes in. We are seeing patients who are surviving, but surviving with long-term lung complications. So this isn't, this isn't a virus in which we know exactly how it is doing this. I mean, we actually don't know how it is doing all of this stuff. How do you get a virus that gives you an acute liver injury? Okay, a virus that can give you an acute myocardial infarct. Now, we've got all the treatments for a liver injury. We've got all of the treatments for a myocardial infarct. We've got all of the treatments for pulmonary embolism. But if you put them all together, we still cannot make sense of this virus. And therefore, the evidence that both of my colleagues have been mentioning is so few. There are currently a few randomized controlled trials going on of various medications, and you might have heard of some are antiretrovirals, especially one of them that Donald Trump is taking, which has got a very poor evidence base, by the way. Some of them are, for example, for steroids, which you've heard. So dexamethasone makes a difference, but it only makes a difference to patients going to ITU. And we are still looking into other medications which we might have to make a difference. But a randomized controlled trial needs recruitment of numbers. Those are ongoing. It needs to be done over a specific amount of time, because that's the only way you can see if harm is being achieved. And in particular, with regards to the vaccination program that might or might not be coming, about whether or not the benefits outweigh the risks. Right? Now, any vaccine will have risks attached to it. And if the benefit is 3 weeks of antibody protection, the benefit is not enough. So this is the standard by which doctors will measure all medicines. And it's not because we are being difficult about stepping out of the box. It's because we are thinking of the health of our patients, but across the board, as opposed to singular anecdotal instances. And I know it's very difficult, when you are in the middle of the eye of the storm as the patient and the family of the patient, and it is crucial that you want the best for your particular loved one at that particular time. But as doctors, we have to look at the picture around that patient and actually say, what is the best that we can do for that patient, and what is the evidence that supports us in our decision. If we didn't do that, then we would be mavericks. And we would be dangerous, because we would make a call one day based on gut feeling or based on just, what we think is right, and we would make the wrong call. Sometimes we make the right call, but sometimes we would make the wrong call if it's just based on gut feeling. So I'm afraid it does come down to the evidence, which is really the short answer, which both my colleagues have pointed out.
Okay, I think this.
If I quickly may, Doc, just I don't necessarily need an answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is the Journals of Orthomolecular Medicine has been collecting studies and trials on nutritional medicine, on medicines such as vitamin C for the last, I think, about 70 years. What I'm asking is, if there is some evidence of that, of the efficacy of something that is, it's a general question more than necessarily a COVID question. It would help COVID, but it's a more general question. If there's some evidence of something helping with a disease, a sickness, a pandemic, a plague, which could reduce the deaths, there seems to be a general reluctance and almost an arrogance with respect to all of you. All doctors are not the same. Almost an arrogance of doctors to look into something. And there are many doctors. There's a doctor, I think his name is Dr. Cheng, who's running who did a trial in Shanghai, where every patient who, even though they were on ventilators, who they put on 25 grams of vitamin C for the day or throughout the day, divided doses, etc., where the trial showed positive results, and I think no one died. In another trial, there was one person who died, and that person was in their 90s. I don't necessarily need a response, but what I'm saying is there seems to be a general reluctance and a fear because of all the regulations, because fear to do no harm maybe, because intentions might be good, but to step outside of the box a little bit and become holistic, just like we need to holistically look at the earth, holistically look at why we are where we are today. Why is it that we struggle?
Kasim, can I just come in on that? So you're right. You know, I mean, all doctors are bound by certain regulations, but the regulations are put in place to protect patients. So so while we all would like to step out of the box, we can only step out of that box securely if we know we are not putting our patients at risk. Now, for all of the studies that someone can quote, and I haven't particularly looked at the ones you quoted, for all of the studies that someone can quote, Dr. Al-Fassi has already mentioned there's something called a meta-analysis. It actually takes a long period of time to actually look at the quality of the studies, then put it in a meta-analysis, and then look at the overall benefit. So what I would suggest is that what I know of some of these meta-analysis on vitamin C is that if it suggests no benefit, then I think it's really up to the individual doctors about whether they prescribe it or not and the doses that they prescribe it in. And although we have evidence that might range over 50 to 70 years, some of that is historical evidence, and some of that evidence would be weaker in some studies than in others. So, so it's not a straightforward answer. And I know this isn't just about COVID. This is maybe a wider question about how medicine is practiced. But unfortunately, medicine is practiced for the doctor to remain a safe practitioner with regulations in place. And all of that is for the benefit of the patient. It is not that we are being, difficult or don't want to be holistic, but for some of it, we are constrained because our professional regulatory bodies will take us to task if we step out of those regulations and we cause harm. So it's not a reluctance or an arrogance. It is actually part of our regulatory body. If we don't want to be regulated, then we can simply come off the roll and no longer practice as doctors.
Okay, I think we've way over our time limit. So I'm going to ask each of you in a reverse order, any final comments and thoughts, and maybe you want to add what the customer has mentioned, but 2 minutes each. I'll start first with Dr. Al-Farsi, then with Dr. Abrams, and then conclude with Dr. Woodman. So Dr. Al-Farsi, any final comments and remarks that you want to make?
I just want to say thank you all. It's been like a pleasure, and I really enjoyed both lectures of Dr. Woodman and Abraham. Thank you very much, and Dr. Taj, of course, giving me the privilege to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Abrams, any concluding remarks?
Yeah, thanks very much. It's really been a very informative evening. I just want to say one last thing to Kasim, that it just seems to me that he's going through a very difficult time and he has a lot of unanswered questions, and it's kind of becoming a point of anger, and that's going to really detract from his grieving process. And I think maybe it's a good idea if he could actually just speak to the doctor himself and just have his questions answered as to why certain treatments were decided and why certain treatments were removed. And it'll just help you to understand what happened and try and move on from that very excruciatingly painful episode.
Dr. Woodman?
Hi, yes. So I think my final words is just, I think if we take any lessons from what is currently happening around us, I really think we need to rethink, how we approach the world around us and how we think of our relationship you know, to all of life on earth and towards each other as well. And yes, I do think that there's hope for the future. I think if we look at the historical responses to plagues and epidemics in the past, there had always been this very despairing attitude as if everything is coming to an end. But you know, it does move things on. It does move things along. And so I think there is, you know, a hope in terms of, you know, if we learn from this experience, we can attempt to prevent it from happening again. I think there is a lot of work that is going to be needed to be done over a long period of time by all of the faith groups to look at those who have actually come through this experience, who have survived it, who have had, you know, the most awful bereavements, who have not had the opportunity or the time because of an ongoing crisis to work through all of that pain and all of the heartbreak that this particular pandemic has caused us. And I think we all need to, you know, make sure that we provide, you know, that kind of supportive atmosphere and supportive embracing arms so that we can actually, you know, reach out and actually help each other through this. And I think that's probably all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, all the speakers. So next month, we have our monthly webinar again, the last Wednesday of the month. And the topic will be quite different from this time. It'll be the concept of forgiveness in the Abrahamic religions. What does each of these three great faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, teach us about forgiveness? Can we and do we forgive everyone, irrespective or their conditions connected to pardoning and clemency and forgiveness? And we'll have 4 speakers this next month. We'll have, of course, a Jewish representative. We will have an Eastern Orthodox minister, plus a Western Christian, and of course, a Muslim speaker. So if you're interested in attending next month, we'll be delighted to have you. And every month we want to take a subject that has some relevance and some pertinence and to discuss and to learn and to grow. And as Siti has mentioned, for all of us, especially the 3 great monotheistic religions, for us to come closer together. So thank you very much, everyone. And until next time, enjoy yourself. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.